Hello everyone, and welcome to the second talk of the 2024-2025 OCHS Virtual Winter Speaker Series. My name is Ben Falter. I'm the Director of Education at the Ontario County Historical Society in Canandaigua, New York. And before I turn things over to our wonderful presenter, just a couple quick announcements. First, this speaker series highlights topics related to photography to coincide with our current exhibit, From Studio Portraits to Snapshots, all about photography in Ontario County. And if you have not already come to the museum to see the exhibit, I would definitely recommend doing so before it closes at the end of April. As always, Wilma, our wonderful curator, does a fantastic job putting these exhibits together. And if you want to come visit the Historical Society, you can find out information about the Historical Society, our hours, all that stuff on our website. There's a link to our website in the description of the video that you're watching right now. I also want to thank you for tuning in this evening and helping support the Historical Society. If you have any questions or comments during the talk, please type them into the live chat, and I will pass them on during the Q&A period at the end of the talk. Also, you can always access video playback of this talk after it concludes using the same link you're using to tune in right now. So if there was something really interesting in this talk that you liked a lot and you want to refer back to it later, you can click on that same link and watch it all over again. But without further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker tonight. Gerry Szymanski is Senior Librarian for Reserves and Digital Services at the Sibley Music Library at the Eastman School of Music, University of Rochester. He's an award-winning filmmaker and composer, and is an adjunct professor of musicology. Also, he's a noted photographer and collector, and has had exhibitions at the Rochester Public Central Library and Monroe Community College, and has lectured about photography at the Flower City Arts Center, MCC, and St. John Fisher University. His photographs have appeared in City Magazine, the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, and South Wedge Quarterly. And recently, images from his historic collection were on display at the Genesee Country Village and Museum as part of their Becoming Gendered Garment as Gender Artifact exhibition in the John L. Wehle Gallery. And if you didn't get a chance to go see that exhibit, apologies, it was a fantastic exhibit, but you should go see GCVM's current exhibit about cemeteries and headstones. Anyway, but if you want to learn more about Gerry, you can find a link to his website also in the description of this talk. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Gerry and let him take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. It's been a real pleasure preparing this talk and doing this research. My talk today has kind of a curious title. It's called Dental Diversions, or Two Doctors Who Tinkered More Than Teeth. And there's me. So since my talk today is going to be a lot about the 1840s and 1850s, I did want to pay tribute to what just happened in the last couple of days here in Monroe County, in Brockport, right in the village of Brockport, and with the terrible fire at the Morgan Manning House. I got to visit there a few years ago, and it was really quite spectacular. And for anyone who's sort of interested in the mid-century, 19th century, this house was really pretty special. And so I'm hopeful that things can really work out for this to get resurrected. I know it did back in the 60s, and hopefully it will happen again today. People are really sad about it, and I'm really sad. I just wanted to give another plug for this amazing show. This is a terrific exhibit, and these are just a couple of photographs that I was able to snap yesterday when I came to the museum to visit. It's just phenomenal, phenomenal. Hopefully you'll be able to see it before the end of the turn there at the end of April. It is really quite wonderful. So thanks again for asking me to be part of this series that's connected to this amazing exhibit. Yeah. So when we think about Rochester in the mid-century, Rochester in the decade, from 1845 to 1855, it was really hopping. This was Flower City. All these mills that were around with these races with water rushing through these buildings, turning millstones, creating buttons and shoes and all sorts of stuff. This town was really the biggest boom town in America, the Young Lion of the West. And this is an engraving that is from the early 1850s that shows the Erie Canal coming right through town. Here's Main Street, here's the river. We were really at the nexus of all of this going on, this super connector highway of water that took us all the way from New York City to the Great Lakes, and of course the river that was used to bring all sorts of goods up into town. And as such, there were all sorts of things happening, including photography. This is what is known as the first photograph of Rochester. It's held at the George Eastman Museum. It's by Whitney, and in the very center of this, on this building that you can see, that hopefully you can see my mouse moving over here. You see it says Whitney's daguerreotypes. This is actually the four corners of Rochester. This is Buffalo, Maine, State, and Exchange. And this is going upstate. And here on the left-hand side, we have the Eagle Hotel, which became the Powers Building. So this is what's known as the very first image of Rochester from 1852. And of course, people in Rochester had teeth back then, and they needed dentists. At one point, around 1850, there were 15 different dentists in town practicing. And you can sort of imagine why. This is before Crest and Colgate, before dental floss, before all sorts of wonderful things that we have, like fluoride to make our mouths wonderful things. But yeah, people started advertising, and if they weren't advertising in the newspapers, they were advertising in the directories. And so here we have a dentist who is directly across from the Eagle Hotel in that picture. So he would have been directly on the right-hand side of that picture in the Smiths building, opposite the Eagle Hotel. Here we have another fellow, Mr. Morgan, Dr. Morgan. All operations in the teeth performed with skill and at short notice. Here we have Dr. Wanzer, plate, and they're warranted equal to any artificial teeth in the known world. We often think of P.T. Barnum as being sort of the person that sort of was, touting things with all this crazy exuberant language. But boy, you see this, when you see the toothache with all its accompanying afflictions. I love how this one, he has references. You can actually ask people what kind of dentist he was, which I think is pretty crazy cool. Here is a different detailer or a dealer that sells tooth powder for cleansing and preserving the teeth. And you can buy it at all these drugstores, but I guess it was made there on Platt Street, which of course is right near the Pont de Rennes. That's the bridge that crosses over to the Genesee Brewery. That was at one time the Platt Street Bridge. Here's another tooth, mouth, sort of denture, Crane and Clark, dentist, concert hall building. So you could go hear some music and go to the dentist. Hopefully the cries of pain were not enough to drown out any of the tunes. And I love, of course, this era of the late 1840s and early 1850s, the topography is just phenomenal. And how they picked this font to say that these fake teeth are preferred to natural ones. I don't know. It's kind of crazy. And you could also buy his book, A Guide to Sound Teeth, for sale at several bookstores. He also had references, and some of these, were important people, professors, reverends, lots of ministers that got their teeth fixed by this particular dentist. So, and here is an image of some dental tools. These were things used to pull teeth. This one probably had a bone or ivory handle. Ouch. Maybe a little scraping. Maybe. So if you're squeamish, don't look. Here's some dentures. Okay, you can look. Here is something that's actually kind of nicer. This is a very beautifully carved either bone or ivory tooth set for someone. There you can see the little cat on the top here. And this had a little pick and a little brush. So, there were some things out there. It wasn't like people were just rubbing their teeth with sticks. And so we begin to talk about one of these two people, the two people that tinkered. And this guy, William Tishner, didn't live very long. We'll learn about that, but he moved to Rochester in the, 1842, 43. He had been living in Waterloo. He and his wife, Bethia, had already four children. Here's a painting of him that's held at the Rochester Museum and Science Center. Kind of like a early, 1840s kind of guy, looking pretty confident with his cane there. And when he was working in town in Rochester, he was working pretty much in this sort of neighborhood of the Four Corners, and that's pretty much what that arrow is pointing to. Here it says Carroll Street, which was renamed State Street, but it's kind of right at the intersection of everything that was happening in Rochester. And when we look in the directory, we see in 1844 that he was on Buffalo Street. And you might be thinking, what's Buffalo Street? I don't know what Buffalo Street is. I mean, there's like Buffalo Road out in Chili, but way back when, the Four Corners were four separate streets. It was north, it was Carroll, which became States, and it continued down south to Exchange. And then you had Main Street, which started there and went across the river. And then that was Buffalo Street. Now it's East Main Street, going off towards Susan B. Anthony's house, but at the time it was Buffalo Street. And he was at 12 and a half, so it was probably a pretty small little space. And then you see here in 1845, the very next year, that he's actually partnered with another dentist, a guy whose last name is Resegui. And they were in the second store just down the street, second story just down the street. And he was only partnered with this particular dentist for 2 months. We know sometimes that businesses have a very short duration, but this partnership was not that great. And before, one of the things that they kind of forced him to do this, to partner up with this other dentist, is that he had a fire. And fires back then were just so common, and he ended up losing all of his equipment. And he lost some money. His insurance didn't cover it. Like 1/4 of the value was not covered. And so he really tried to get back on his feet as quickly as possible. He lost all of his records and all that kind of thing. And so he partnered up with this particular dentist. And what's really curious is that the very first patient that he saw when he started his practice, the very first patient paid, and I know it's hard to read, but it says by miniature, which was worth $3. Now, what is that? What's a mini? It's like it's a doll? What's a miniature? Well, a miniature was a photograph, a Daguerrean photograph. And here's an advertisement for another photographer in the same kinds of directories that all these other dentists were advertising in. Here is Mr. Marsh. And you can see this giant arrow pointing to this little word that says miniatures. And it's in there a whole bunch of times. They were calling these miniatures in the 1840s, Daguerrean miniatures. Now, I have one that I have in my hand. This is from my own collection. This is a miniature. It is not life size. If you open this up and you take a look inside, there is a daguerreotype of a fellow that you can sort of see. And this is a Daguerrean miniature. It's a smaller version of, say, a painted portrait that you would have had that would have been life size. And so it's very curious to me that the very first sale, I guess you could say, the very first operation, the very first dental work that he did with his new partnership, he did not get paid in money. He got paid in a miniature. Now, what was in that miniature? We'll find out. But yeah, here's a picture that ended up in Tishner's sort of archive of stuff. And if you look over here, it says Clark's, and it says that the person who paid by miniature was J.M. Clark. And so there's a good chance that this might be our dentist, which is kind of a cool thing. And as we discovered, the Daguerrean folks had their office in the same building at 16 Buffalo Street. Here's another picture of a miniature, and this is somebody that you all know from the mid 1840s. You can kind of see. Now, the daguerreotypes, of course, are super shiny, so not only can you see the figure that's on the plate, but you can also see a reflection of the red velvet. You can see there's like a vase, and you can also see a reflection of this young lady who's holding this particular daguerreotype. Here it is a little bit more close up and straightforward. And there's our friend Edgar Allan Poe as a Daguerrean miniature. That year, he also built a house. And if you notice, this is pretty much in Greek Revival style. There were so many Greek Revival houses in Rochester. His house was up North Clinton Avenue, right at the edge of the city, right near what became Clifford Avenue. And we actually have the plans for his house, which is kind of crazy and cool. So it was kind of a busy year. But yeah, it was also this year that he started getting interested in the telegraph. Now, the telegraph, is this wonder of invention. And it really can be, put all on the head of this particular person, Samuel F.B. Morse. And this is a daguerreotype of him as an older fellow, probably from the 1860s. But he was somebody who was doing all sorts of things. He was a polymath. He started out as an artist. Here's a painting by Samuel F.B. Morse. His specialty was young ladies in all these eastern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Washington. Um, he was really quite renowned as a painter of young ladies in the 1830s and early 1840s, but he was also tinkering with scientific stuff. And as we know now, he was also tinkering with photography. Samuel Morse actually was in Paris and met Louis Daguerre of the daguerreotype right before Daguerre was about to announce his invention to the world. Here's a portrait of Louis Daguerre, and this is actually held at the George Eastman Museum. This is a daguerreotype of Daguerre. How's that? Here's this daguerreotypist taking a photograph of this young lady. And I don't know if you know this, but Daguerre decided not to make money off of his invention. He decided to give it to the world in exchange for a pension that was given to him by the French government. And Daguerre announced that this was this new technology that everyone in the world could use. And Morse was one of the very first people in America to make daguerreotypes. He learned this process. And what's also amazing is that we only have one surviving daguerreotype by Morse. There's his name on this plate, this brass plate. And there's this image of this young man in the case. It's also a miniature. It's astonishing that this incredibly important person who created this invention later, not that much later, just a few years, and was not like the first person to really do this in America, to create photographs. We only have one surviving photograph. But he started to teach other people how to do it. And two people that he taught how to do it are Southworth and Hawes, who had a daguerreotype studio in Boston. And here are their portraits between 1845 and 1850. And these two guys created some of the most astonishing images of much less early photography. And they learned how to do it from Samuel F.B. Morse. So here we have a photograph on the left of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here we have a photograph on the right of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. These are all people that you know. And here we have a photograph of Rollin Neal. And this photograph, which is of a Baptist minister, graces the cover of this book, Young America, the Daguerreotypes of Southworth and Hawes. And this book, which is right here, is a catalog of this exhibition at the George Eastman Museum of these two daguerreotypists that were taught by Samuel F.B. Morse. So that's a thing. He also taught a guy named Matthew Brady. Here's a picture of Matthew Brady as a younger fellow. Here he is a little bit older with a goatee with his sisters. Here's a self-portrait daguerreotype. They were all looking off into the future. And of course, we know Brady because he started to take photographs, made photographs of paper, and he started to take photographs of this guy. So we would not have photographs of Abraham Lincoln that look like this if it wasn't for Samuel Morse. And this one on the right-hand side is pretty important because it's the picture that's on the $5 bill. So how crazy is that? It's pretty wild. So let's go back to our doctor, our dentist. he sort of learned about telegraphy, and he learned about it when this telegraphy was demonstrated in 1844, May 12th. Here's Millard Fillmore, the president was there. Here's a guy named Ezra Cornell. They were all there when this happened. And what happened was a message was sent from Washington to Baltimore, and the message was, "What hath God wrought?" And it was sent electrically over wires from one, telegraph machine to another. Here it's at the Smithsonian, the original message, "What hath God wrought?" It's a Bible verse. What has God created? And of course, this created quite a sensation. Now, Morse tried to get the government interested in his invention, and Congress was a little skeptical. This is like no one was communicating over electronic wires. There was no such thing as electronics in the 1840s. And so this is where we have this other fellow from Rochester, this sort of first fellow from Rochester appearing. You may not have ever heard of him. He was originally born in Ireland. His name is Henry O'Reilly. He ended up writing this book that was sort of in tribute to Rochester in 1838, just around the time we became a city, published by Alling, which later became Alling and Corey, the paper company here in town until just a few years ago. Sketches of Rochester. It's like 400 pages long. It's crazy, crazy, crazy. It's this amazing thing. So he was born in Ireland, lived here in Rochester, wrote this book, actually was part of our government for a while, was part of the Board of Education, Erie Canal, yada, yada, yada. But he approached this guy, who's, you can see his name in here, Amos Kendall, who was an agent for Morse, to actually try to create something with telegraphy. He had not the faintest idea of what it would take to secure lumber and wire to string up lines across the wilderness between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and to maintain them. And he had these very vague contracts between Morse's agents and himself. They were so vague that they allowed other companies to take over his work with better service, and the courts allowed it. And this, of course, all played out in the newspaper. An article about the telegraph line between this city and Baltimore will be completed in a week or 10 days. You also see that he's actually featured in an entire volume of the Rochester History Journal, little pamphlet. And this couple of lines here, it says, "Henry O'Reilly was no doubt not one of the greatest figures connected with the city of Rochester. He was not born here. He did not spend the major part of his life here. And when he died, he had long outlived the period of his major youthfulness." It says he was volatile, improvident, quarrelsome. He was a great man for starting something and a poor man for finishing anything. And in other places, this calls him a hothead. And so this was kind of a total failure. It just did not work. And so we go back to our dentist because it happened like in the second, a little bit after this, towards the end of that year of 1845. This was the entirely brand new Congress Hall. It was near the river and the railroad station. It's no longer with us, unfortunately. But Tishner started this little telegraph company. And there are some things about history that are a mystery, and this is one of them. We don't know exactly what he did. And I'm reading now from Ernst Umberger Jr.'s book or pamphlet in the Rochester History about our Dr. Tishner, that it says that he invented improvements in the method of applying the electric fluid to the magnetic telegraph. What does that mean? It's a wire. There's no fluid. But he applied for patents in December of 1845 and also in January of 1846, and we've never been able to find those patents. Now, he had some of this reported in the newspaper as well, and there was actually a line that was strung up between Rochester, Utica, Albany, in September, it's all, etc. But like, what was this actual thing, And the newspapers were kind of vague, and they described this thing called a machine resembling the keyboard of a piano, each key representing the letter or figure, so that by a single touch of the key, the entire letter is made. And what's wild is that we have no drawings of this machine, no specific accounts of its construction, no patent application for the machine. It's kind of wild and crazy that we don't really know much about what this is. So a few years later, 30 years later, here's this book called The Telegraph in America. It's founders and promoters of noted men. It's by this guy named James Reed, who actually did do a lot in telegraphy, published in 1879. And Dr. Tishner doesn't appear until page 305. So it's pretty far along for a thing that was only introduced in 1844. So that's a lot of stuff. And he only appears, this is the only place where he appears. So, but I love this. Albany was heard pounding away at his key, asking Rochester, "Do you hear me?" On Rochester sending back the delighted reply, "To be sure I do." Albany quickly rejoined, "Ha ha, Dr. Tishner, give me your hand." And then there was a little telegraphic experience with the people watching. These words, communicated to the attending crowd, were caught up by the excited spectators and passed from mouth to mouth. And the telegraph and the mysterious yada, yada, yada. So one little mention, one little mention. And in fact, he is not mentioned in this more contemporary book called The Victorian Internet. And neither is Henry O'Reilly. He's also not mentioned on this incredibly called Timeline of North American Telegraphy. It's on Wikipedia. It's got just like all this stuff, and Henry O'Reilly is mentioned in this one a whole bunch of times. So, Dr. Tishner was this little blip because, we see that in his dental record of like his patients that it kind of petered out and he didn't have a lot of patients. But boy, he went back to being a dentist. So what did happen in that room? The room where it happened, where what hath God wrought? Well, we have, in sequence here, Morse, President Fillmore, Ezra Cornell, and this guy, also from Rochester. This guy, Hiram Sibley. He was in the room where it happened. And he was wealthy enough because he had not only been the sheriff of Monroe County, but was president of the bank to realize that this could be a real thing. This could actually be a real thing. And so by the end of the 1840s, he started working with Mr. Selden, whose son was Judge Selden of the Susan B. Anthony case, and whose grandson helped to invent the car, and founded Western Union. And it's still going as a money transfer business. It stopped sending telegrams in 2006, but for a company that started in the 1850s to go to 2006 is pretty good. Yeah, Western Union became the first monopoly because it became the first telecommunications network. And here are some employees. Of course, this is much later. This is from the 20s. These were the telegram boys. But it was great. It was a really cool thing in that you would go to an office, you would write a message, they would send it across the wires, someone else would transcribe the Morse code, hand it to one of these guys, and then they would deliver it to you at your house. That's just kind of an astonishing thing that this happened. And it was happening here in the United States, you know. But again, Hiram Sibley is not mentioned in the Victorian Internet. It's so Victorian Internet book, while it's a fascinating walk through a pivotal period in human history, is entirely accurate. Is none of these guys from Rochester are in this. Of course, Hiram Sibley set up his office for Western Union in the Reynolds Arcade. And here's a photograph from the Stone Collection. Now it's a little hard to see, but right in the middle, underneath Arcade, it says Telegraph. And here's a larger image of another sign that says Western Union Telegraph and Cable Office. It was headquartered here in town in the 1850s for about 10 years. And I would say that, Hiram Sibley was like one of the first sort of tech bros because he made a lot of money. He tried to go to Russia. He tried to get this to go up here, which is from, America to, over here to Russia, which is Alaska. He convinced Seward to make Seward's Folly the purchase of Alaska so that he could send a telegraph line across it. Of course, this was all thwarted when the Atlantic cable went across from New York to London. So there you go. Did you know it was the eighth wonder of the world? Now you do. Oh, yeah, that guy Cornell. He did okay. He founded a university and he remained friends with his telegraph pal, Hiram Sibley. This building is the Sibley Building on the Cornell campus. It is now the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. Go figure. Not only did Hiram Sibley make tons of money from telegraphy, but he also started a seed company because we were becoming the flower city, Flower. Look at that giant building. I have no idea where that was, but wow. There's actually a melon named after him, which is crazy. And of course, like a lot of rich people, you give money away as you're, comfortable and older. And he gave money to the University of Rochester for the Sibley Hall and Museum. This was on the Prince Street campus. Here's a nice stone picture with some sphinxes. And here it is. This building, the Anderson building, is still there. It's where the United Way is located. And this building is no longer there. It's where the Red Cross building is. And you can see there are some figures of goddesses in the alcoves, and they're actually over by the Rusheries Library now. And yeah, it was like a big deal for this to be the main university library that came from money from telegraphy. You can see it right here on the map up here. And here is where it would be now. Here's the Anderson building, and here's where Sibley Hall was. And you can still see these sidewalks, which is crazy. It's like you can see these from space, So his son, Hiram W., who lived off of his father's money and was fabulously wealthy, founded the Sibley Musical Library inside his father's library, built by telegraphy. And it was in the Sibley Hall for a while, and then, of course, it moved. And here it is in its second location. And it was quite a lovely thing. Okay, back to the dentist. He's given up telegraphy. He's back to doing his thing. He actually rents a space in the Reynolds Arcade. So 10 years before Western Union is formed, here's the dentist moving from Congress Hall to become a dentist again. This was, of course, built by Abelard Reynolds in the 1820s, 1828. And by 1845, his son William, who was younger, but in this picture is older, signed the contract. Here's sculptures of these guys that were in the hall, which is pretty cool. We actually have the contract that Tishner signed to have his office, his dental office there, and it's pretty cool. And this is what Reynolds Arcade looked like in the early 1850s. So this would have been very contemporaneous, very Dickensian. We don't really think of Rochester often as sort of having this kind of culture, but it sure did. In 1847, though, he decided to leave his office. And you're probably seeing a pattern here. In this very short amount of time, he has just been moving, doing something else. So he decides to move to his house on North Clinton near the city line. And of course, here is his house. And so this is where Dr. Tishner moved. He even had this advertisement that said, "At home again." And there you go. So he was able to, build this pretty nice house. He was able to have his office in his house like a lot of dentists and optometrists do, which is pretty cool. But boy, I'll tell you something, poor guy, he only lived another year. So he had this super brief life. But he had this very interesting life because he was a dentist and he moved around and he did all these things and he was interested in telegraphy and did something that we can't quite explain. But what's fascinating is that his kids were really little when he passed away. They were all younger kids. But his wife stayed in the house. And his wife was Bethia Augusta Cherry Tishner. And his daughter, who's not on that find a grave because for some reason we don't know exactly where she's buried, but his daughter, also known as Bethia, married a photographer. And this is a photographer taken by him. Now, it's from the Albert Stone Negative Collection, but these are pictures that were taken by a guy named James P. Walter. And James P. Walter married William Tishner's daughter. And in this picture, you see William Tishner's daughter, William Tishner's widow, and William Tishner's grandchildren. You see Charles Henry and you see Florence. And this is Charles Henry and Florence. And this is their dog, Jip, Dalmatian. And what's really cool is that this is the house and this is the studio of James P. Walter, photographer. So the son-in-law of this dentist was a photographer. And here you see Jip and you see more kids and you see the daughter, Bethia August. And it's pretty wonderful. This is the back of the place. And what we find with the surviving photographs from James P. Walter is that they're either domestic scenes right there on North Clinton and Clifford, or from just down the street. A few years later, he had made enough money to build this fabulous house on Clifford, which is just phenomenal. to me is that there's this massive house that they built in this sort of arts and crafts style in the 1890s. And so uh, it's just fascinating to me that there's this photographic connection. Here are Florence and here are Charles Henry and a photograph taken by Walter, probably in that building, in that studio, with all these things of childhood, with their straw hats and sailor suits. And here is the Walter family album in the collection at the George Eastman Museum, which I think is pretty amazingly cool. All the surviving photographs we have from James Walter are either architectural sort of outside pictures that are in that neighborhood or family pictures. And in that picture, you see Florence, and there she is rubbing her eyes. And here's a fellow, Clifford Avenue, with his sulky, with his cart. And this looks like it's sort of an oversized cabinet card, which is pretty amazing. I have not really been able to find any pictures taken by Walter in any other places. I don't have any pictures by Walter in my own collection, but it's pretty cool. Here's just down the street, St. Michael's Church, which is still in this on North Clinton Avenue. He took a whole bunch of pictures of this, which is amazing. It looks so brand new, which is so cool. And again, these are at the Eastman Museum collection. And there are two pictures of the Dalmatian that they did not print or scan. I'm like, I want to see a picture of Jip. I want to see two pictures of Jip. Anywho, I'm going to have to bug them. So they have 31 different negatives that were created by James Walter. Here's another picture I found on a website. And it's just this family gathering. And you're like, who are they? Now, this is a fabulous picture. Fabulous. Wow, look at all this Victorian stuff. And the description actually talks about the piano. On the back of the photograph is the piano purchased, yada, yada, yada. Florence was 12 years old. We know who Florence is. This is actually James Walter's family. That's James Tischner's family. This is James Tischner's daughter playing cards. So it's just very, very cool that we have this stuff left over. And in these negatives by James P. Walter and with the Tischner papers was this daguerreotype. And there was a copy that he made on a glass plate. He took the daguerreotype apart and he made a copy of it. And we think, and Ernest Umberger thinks, that this is Dr. Tischner. And this was his first payment, was a photograph. So it's very, very cool to see all these connections just with this one fellow and his interests. And of course, all this stuff is at the Rochester Museum and Science Center. It was given to them by Edna Tischner, who was married to Ralph Tischner, who is a grandson of William Tischner. And they have all this paperwork, that photograph, all those photographs of Walter, all those went down through the family. And you know what happened? Of course, the Eastman Museum has some of Walter's pictures as well. And when they moved out of this house, you know what happened? It became a dentist's office again. So there's Dr. Tillotson's office. He moved in there. So there's this crazy connection between calligraphy, dentistry, and photography. All right, let's move to Canandaigua. Let's move to Ontario County. Augustus Coleman. Here is a panel from Wilma's phenomenal display about Augustus Coleman. And what I think is really interesting is that he actually went to dental school, whereas William Tischner had been, sort of self-trained. And so we're talking now about a person whose career is starting literally 10 years later in the mid-1850s, not in the 1840s. And here's a picture, a self-portrait that Augustus Coleman took of himself. Here is his matriculation card that, it's sort of like his student ID card, if you will, that he went to the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, whereas Tischner was just, was sort of an apprenticeship, if you will. And so by this point, there were actually dental colleges. And you can see in the interior 7 to 68 that he already gotten a partner and he was doing it north of the courthouse. He was with Mr. Carman, Dr. Carman. Here they are listed. And here is their advertisement, again, showing that plate. All operations performed in the most thorough manner. And now you see that they're using laughing gas, which I think is amazing. But what is amazingly cool about Augustus Coleman, this dentist, is the change in photography. after Tishner passed away. And a lot of it comes from this goop that you're seeing poured here called collodion. It's being poured onto a glass plate. And collodion led to a revolution in photography. First, in making pictures that were very similar to daguerreotypes. This is, again, one of Wilma's displays. The ambrotype was one of the very first images that used collodion to create this image, this goop, if you will. And I love this exhibit is so exhaustive, telling you the whole entire history of photography and using examples from Ontario County and from the collection. It's really an outstanding thing. So here's another really excellent ambrotype that you can see here. Yeah, and the thing is the ambrotypes are actually negatives. When you created this image on this glass plate, it was actually a negative. And you can see here that this particular image has some black backing behind it and no backing behind it, and it's a negative. And this really led to this revolution in photography because when you could create a negative on glass, you could create a positive on paper. You know, until this point, everything was pretty much a singular item. Here is a glass negative on the left-hand side, and here is a positive of that image on a little CDV on the right-hand side. And so to create these images, to create a glass plate, first of all, you had to polish it, make sure it's super smooth. You had to pour this goop collodion, which is sort of a nitrocellulose acetate on top of it. It looks almost like maple syrup. You coat it. And what that does is it helps the silver halide that's in this ceramic insert that's filled with this chemical that has silver floating in it. It sticks to the glass. And we actually have on the right-hand side, Augustus Coleman's sensitizing tank, the tank that he used in his darkroom to create a sensitized plate. Now, some of these images that you see here are from Mark Osterman, who was the process guy at the George Eastman Museum for many, many years. But it's amazing we have this sensitizing plate. And here is France Osterman using one of these large format cameras. She has put this wet, goopy plate full of collodion and silver halide into a holder. She's put it in the back of this camera. She's taking the lens cap off and she's exposing that plate. And what's also amazing is that we have Augustus Coleman's camera, this giant camera. And this back end on the right-hand side is where that wet plate would have put in the holder. It's really stunning that we have this thing. So, yeah, and it's huge because he took pictures on very large plates. Here's another view of it. It's in the corner, and there's a view of this end. Now, this end is the end that would have had the lens. So it is missing its lens. So what would that have looked like? Well, I found online this picture of what a camera would have looked like, and you can see it's attached to a piece of wood that's then just sort of stuck in that hole there. And these lenses allowed to have fine focus with a knob, and then there were bellows. I mean, it kind of looks like an accordion because you would focus with that, and you would slide the front of the camera back and forth until the subject was in focus. And there was usually a piece of ground glass in the back, and you could focus on that. And the plate would sort of go exactly where the ground glass went so that the image would be in focus on the glass plate as well. So you have your plates, your wet plates inside of this camera, and then you expose it, and then you go into the darkroom and you pour developer over it, and you pour fixer over it. And so this will all be in the dark under a red light. And then you check it, and then you dry it, and you let it dry completely. And then you have your sister help out. Here is Louisa Coleman Hayes, Augustus Coleman's sister. And she kept a diary, and she talked about the fact that she says, oh, here I got photographs in the morning. Or minimalized paper for Augustus this morning, and all these different pictures that he took of all these folks. And what was she doing? Well, she was taking paper that was the same size as the negative, and she was coating it with silver halide and albumin. And albumin was made with egg whites. And they discovered for trial and error that this was the best thing to adhere the silver to the paper. So you would then expose the paper, usually through sunlight. The glass negative is already dried up. It's already ready. It's already on there. The negative's on there. And you put it on top of this piece of paper. You expose it to light for however long you need to, and then you process the paper the same way. You run it through developer, you run it through fixer, you let it dry. It's so complicated, but it's wonderful. And then you get an albumin picture. Now here's an albumin carte de visite. Here's this fine fellow with his straw hat. This is probably from the 1870s. You can see there's a posing stand behind him. Hold him up straight. Here's a detail. It has this sort of warm sepia brown color. In fact, it actually has a little more. It actually has a little tinting on his cheeks. This is actually taken in Canandaigua, Finley and Sons. I found this on eBay. I was just like, well, look. So this is a photographer that Wilma has created an entire panel about, which is awesome. And there's a CDV up there, a carte de visite of Horace Finley, which is super cool. So people were just making albumin pictures like crazy once the paper revolution started. So yeah. So here is one of Augustus Coleman's negatives. You can see it's pretty large. There's Wilma's hand for scale. It's a little bit larger than 8 by 10, and it would have gone right into this camera. So it's kind of mind-blowing that we have his glass negatives and we have the camera that he used them for, which is wild. Here's a photograph of his father, definitely born in the 1700s, and his mother. Here are two portraits of his sister, Louisa, taken on these large glass plates. And because they were so large, the silver is so fine. The detail is so amazing. So very much like Walter taking photographs of his family members and his environs, as you know, kind of a professional photographer, we have Coleman taking pictures of his family members and his environs. And these are the most amazing pictures. These glass plates taken from the cupola of his Italianate house, looking around to see what he could see out the window in all these different directions. And of course, what's astonishing is that Wilma has been able to exhibit and based on the backyards of 1858. Looking at an image like this and being able to figure out all the structures that are still there, that are not there. There's the lake in the distance, pointing out every single thing. And it's just, this is an astonishing, astonishing thing, everybody. It's great to take a picture of one house and maybe another house, but to go up and to take pictures in this complicated process and of each of these directions. It's just amazing. And the detail is stunning. There's the courthouse. There's the old Canandaigua Hotel. It's phenomenal, phenomenal what this amateur photographer was able to do. And I'm so glad that Wim will show me these panels that she created that were taken from these images, just blown up like crazy. That's about, 3.5, 4 feet across. And the detail is just stunning. Here is the Academy. Now it's a little blurry because it's kind of in the background. And yeah, you can see some cracking on the surface of the negative, but that building is still there. That's just amazing. Here is the building, this fabulous house, this super Greek revival brick thing is now the Wood Library. So it is just, I've never seen really anything like this. I mean, Southworth and Hawes took pictures of the Boston Harbor and nothing is there. But these things are here, and this is really astonishing. And then we know that he got into another kind of photography, stereo photography. This is the right-hand side of a stereo image of the family home. And that might even be his father standing there with that super tall top hat. This person here is a little blurry because I didn't pose. And what a stereogram or graph looks like, it looks like this. He was making these at home, which is astonishing. And so while we don't have his camera extant, this is what one of them would have looked like. It would have taken two separate images on a single glass plate with these two lenses that were just enough away from each other, just enough and turned a little bit that the image would be in 3D when you looked at it through a stereo viewer, a little stereo holder. And these were super popular. There were 3D images in the 19th century, which is astonishing. And our Augustus Coleman, our dentist, was making them, which I think is wonderful. Here he is, a little bit older. He's grown a nice beard there. He's got a microscope. And so what else would this, scientist slash dentist slash photographer be interested in? Well, electricity. Stop by to chat with Wilma and Ben brought down these things from the Augustus Coleman collection. Now, what is that? And, huh? I know. It's like, what is this thing? These are wild and crazy and cool. And, there's this fancy, detailed, decorated little thing. And, you know, what is it? Well, it is apparently some sort of electrical apparatus. And here's Wilma's photographs of it a little bit more put together. This is a electrostatic friction machine. What does it do? We're not really sure. It creates like a spark, which is great. So it's sort of Bride of Frankenstein-y. He also had this thing, and you would rub leather on this while you spun it, and it would also create a spark. And yes, you could sort of save a little bit of this energy in like another container, but it's just like, what's the deal? Now, of course, by this point, this is probably closer to 1860s, the telegraphy had been around for a long time. If it's at the end of the 1850s when he acquired these things, telegraphy really kicked in the mid 1850s with Western Union. You could have sent a message everywhere. And so people were just sort of trying to figure out what was up with electricity. So here's Corinthian Hall behind Reynolds Arcade. This is built by the Reynolds. And it was the home of the Rochester Athenaeum and Mechanics Association, which we used to be two groups and became one. And here they are having this lecture in this place about electricity in 1861, just about the same time, within this sort of 5-year period. So for 15 cents, you could go to one of these evenings. I don't know why Thursday, March 28th is so much smaller, but there it is. So people were super interested in electricity. And this, of course, is still like 15 years before the light bulb, 15 years before the telephone. We're trying to figure out what can we do with electricity. So yeah, and of course, you may or may not know this, but the Athenaeum and Mechanics Association is what became RIT. It started right here. That association started offering classes, and then they became the Rochester Institute of Technology, and now it's all of Henrietta. It's pretty much RIT. So it was this little thing. So I the University of Rochester Library actually has a collection of papers, including his sister's diary, including his diary. And it's really pretty cool. They have a whole bunch of stuff that's connected to the Hayes family and the Coleman family, including Augustus Graham Coleman's diary. And I just wanted you to see his signature because he had what is known as a very florid hand. So, yeah. And of course, our Ontario County Historical Society, History Society, has this incredible collection. And what I also love is the fact that both of these people, both Augustus Coleman, the dentist, and our friend Dr. Tishner, have these publications that commemorate their lives. And this not only talks about the images and what's here and what's there, but Wilma talks about his life, talks about his sister. It's really quite a wonderful thing. And so we have these two different folks separated by about 10 years in two different places, but not too far, that are connected through these different things. And I think it's kind of an amazing thing. So yeah, here are the two pamphlets. And of course, you can find these pamphlets on the Rochester Public Library site, but they're kind of buried. You might not have even known these existed, but they do. So two doctors who tinkered. Here are two other doctors who tinkered with, and the actual dentists, that tinkered more with teeth. And they're kind of local. And they're maybe not, it's not so wonderful like photography. The first was Josephus Requa. What a name, Josephus. He actually helped to create the machine gun. And he was this Rochester dentist, and he helped to create the machine gun that was used in the Civil War. So there's that. A Rochester dentist who tinkered in something else. Here's a Buffalo dentist. His name was Alfred Porter Southwick. He's the guy who invented the electric chair. So there you go. If you're a dentist, you can do all sorts of stuff. He could kill people, or you could take their picture, or you could send a message. So I just thought that was really fascinating. And those two guys probably deserve an entire talk on their own, or maybe not. All right, so who else tinkered? Who tinkered? Well, I got to the bank, and this was a fabulous bank. This was the Rochester Savings Bank. And when you see this photograph, this building is still there. It's the Rochester Academy. This building is still there. The oldest public space in Rochester, the Church of St. Luke and St. Cyrene. It's from 1820 something, 28 maybe, the same year as the old Reynolds Arcade. You know, that this building is long gone, but wow, it is like a wedding cake. And in this building, this fabulous bank, worked this one guy as a clerk. So he was an aspiring banker. He was like your teller, the person that you would take money out or put money in your account. But he was interested in science. He was interested in photography. And he started playing around with photography, and he started taking these self-portraits, and he was doing all these tests. And some of it was based on time, some of it was based on light, some of it was based on whatever. He was using himself as sort of taking these selfies as kind of an experiment to perfect something. And the thing he was trying to perfect was this new invention that came by 20 years later, the idea of a dry plate, not a wet plate, a plate that you could actually open up a box and take out and not have to go into a darkroom and prepare and use immediately, take a picture immediately, and then process immediately. Yeah. And of course, that guy was this guy, George Eastman, which is wild, you know. So he was born like, you know, right when Dr. Coleman was making pictures. He was born 10 years after the telegraphy experiments of Dr. Tishner. But yeah, this guy. And I love this cartoon of him. Going camping, George? Nope, going out to take a snapshot. And this is when he was doing wet plate stuff and learning how to do stuff. He carries everything but the kitchen stove. Here's nitrate of silver. Yeah, this is actually George Eastman's first photograph ever. It's of a bridge in Rochester that is no longer there. It's just kind of astonishing. This is Rochester. It's crazy. Yeah. So he started out with creating dry plates. Now they had been invented by someone else, but he improved them and he was able to manufacture them en masse. And of course, man, people just went nuts. And it removed the time element. That was the thing. This was such a huge shift. Yes, it was a physical thing, but it removed the element of time. It meant that you could just take a picture whenever you wanted and put it back in another box, and you could process it later or never. You know, you didn't have to prepare anything. It changed photographic history and history forever. People were still making pictures on paper with these negatives that were being made by these, but this was a big deal. And of course, this led to Kodak film, which led to you press the button and we do the rest, which led to Kodak becoming this massive, massive thing. All because this banker was tinkering. Yeah, creating this incredible company that has been the focus of so much of our regional life. And, you know, when I walk out to my car, I can look out and see the Kodak building, and I can visit his house and this phenomenal museum, which has the photographs of Dr. Tishner's son-in-law. And I work at the Eastman School of Music, which was his pet project towards the end of his life, which now has under its wing the Sibley Music Library, which was created by telegraphy. Here's Hiram W. And of course, to tie this all together, Eastman was very interested in dentistry. And in the center here, on the left-hand side, you see the Eastman Dental Dispensary, which was for all Rochesterians to get dental care. And on the right-hand side, you have this super modern building, which is the Eastman Dental School. And so with these three fellows, you pretty much have it all. You have dentistry, you have telegraphy, you have photography, you have people tinkering with things that are not their main profession, and being able to make a bit of a difference, a lot of difference in the world. And so that's it. That's my talk. And I hope you enjoyed it. And hopefully we have a couple of questions.
Yeah, wow, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Well,
I loved all the sort of connections and stuff you were able to
well,
make
thank you.
here.
Thank you. Thank
Yes,
you, sir.
folks, if you have any burning questions, please ask them in the chat. There is about a 30-second delay between us now and the people watching,
Oh,
so
okay.
it'll take
Great.
them a second to catch up with us. But
Sure.
there
Yeah. So
was
Ben, if you have a question for me,
yeah,
on the
I
prompt.
always write down questions I have, but
Great.
I already did have one in the chat that came in during the talk.
All right, cool.
So, this question is just about the cost of early cameras. How much would it have cost to do photography?
Oh, lots. The Colemans were pretty well off. They
Yeah,
they they got money in the 1840s to move to Canandaigua, which is at the time, a pretty nice town, build that beautiful Italianate house.
right.
I mean, he went on a grand tour of Europe. These
Yeah,
For him, he was not a poor person.
right.
But, as Wilma says in her tag, there's a good chance that camera was actually made by a local carpenter. So it's not like he was maybe buying the Gurian kit or a kit from a camera company in New York City or Philadelphia, which is where a lot of photography was happening in America. A lot of really photography was happening in Philadelphia on Chestnut Street. And there were lots of photo supply places. But even in Rochester, there was like a Daguerrean supply store that would have started to morph into a glass plate supply store and a supply store for photographers, both professional and amateur, to be able to purchase, glass plates, chemicals, camera apparatus, lenses, that kind of thing. I can't give you a figure, but it would have been like a rich person's or a wealthier person's hobby. And even the same with the brownie. I have seen, though I can't quote you, figures that the folks that were experimenting with the brownie camera, which was preloaded, and they would print the pictures when you send the camera back in. It was pretty expensive. It was pretty expensive. And I think what we know about Eastman is that he was trying his experiments he was living with his widowed mother. His father had died. They didn't have a lot of money. And he was doing his experiments in the kitchen sink, and I haven't had a chance to ask Wilma, but like, where did where did Dr. Coleman create his pictures? We have in Louise's diary that she actually sewed a dark room by sewing cloth together
Hmm.
to create a space. So if it was in the house, if it was in an outbuilding, can you imagine he would take a picture out his window of Canandaigua from the cupola of that building and then have to maybe go down all the way upstairs with this wet plate in the holder and then go into this dark space.
Wow.
But it was not a hobby for the lower middle classes, if you will,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And especially because we see that he got into stereo photography and had to buy another camera,
Yeah.
or had to buy another set of lenses to go on his existing camera to create the stereo images.
Yeah.
We know that he was able to, sort of up his stuff,
Yeah.
and this is
Yeah.
what happens, of course, with photographers today that are still using like DSLR. You have your eye on a lens, or you have your eye on, lighting equipment, and you just sort of have to wait till you get it. But he may have been able to get his stuff pretty much right away once he became interested in the topic. Wilman describes that he may have gotten interested in Europe, but by this point, in the mid 1850s, late early 1850s, there were so many photography studios all around, and it's just fascinating to me that he wasn't a commercial photographer. Our last talk was about a commercial studio in town, which is great, and there were, of course, photographs that were taken of family members, as folks do, But what's amazing to me is that with Walter, like I don't see any surviving photographs from this professional photographer
Yeah.
that are not just these sort of intimate images of his family, of his own little neighborhood. He's somebody that I really want to try to find a picture from, like a studio photograph from. You
Yeah.
know, we see that picture of the two kids on the teeter-totter that looks like a studio photo. So that's probably inside his studio. But so far, I have been unable to locate. I even looked through the database at the Genesee Country Village, which has hundreds of pictures, a lot of them from the 19th century. And his pictures would have been like what we sort of call photo on a card. They would have been, that's those transitional ones. A lot of times they're on like a grayish card and they're all different sizes. And he would have started to do things like crayon portraits. He would have done a lot more enlargements and reductions, that kind of thing with his glass negatives. So, it, yeah. So the short answer is it wouldn't have been a cheap hobby. It was not like gardening where you just planted seeds and took care of it. This
Yeah.
was an expensive hobby,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I got to tell you, one other thing is that when you look at a lot of those pictures that were taken with the Brownie cameras by amateurs, maybe wealthy amateurs, technically the processing is great, but they're really crappy pictures. I mean, there's just like, you know, there might be some of you in the audience that remember those Instamatic cameras that were kind of skewed, and so that you took more of the ceiling than the people that we were focusing on. Well, a lot of the pictures that were from the early brownies are just super crappy pictures because they were crappy photographers.
Hmm.
But when you look at these pictures, especially these portraits that Coleman took, they're really very fine.
Yeah.
I mean, the Walters pictures, the architectural pictures, the outside pictures, they're great. But that portrait of the kids, that portrait from inside, it's really hard to take a nice picture inside.
Yeah.
In the 1890s, those people sitting around, reading or playing cards, that is a really fine image. These are very fine images. These are technically and artistically very beautiful. And so for an amateur to take pictures like this is also a really great thing.
Yeah.
He could have been a semi-wealthy guy with a camera taking crappy pictures. you know,
Yeah.
and we wouldn't have a show or a book or this talk,
Yeah.
you know.
Great.
So, uh,
I have another question from the chat, which is actually very similar to a question I was going to ask. So
okay,
that
sure.
that worked out nicely. The question is, was it normal for people, or at least for wealthy people, to be doing all these things at once? Their occupation and tinkering, moving, making big changes. Um, and the commenter in the chat said that they feel like now it's either one or the other. You're not really doing all of
Right.
this at once.
Yeah. I think when you think of like American culture, there seemed to be a big boon in hobbies, especially after World War II. And you started to see like Popular Mechanics and Popular Science and all these sort of magazines that told you how to do, crafts. And, dad would putter around in the basement and make stuff, And, women got into all sorts of crafts like macrame. Even kids were doing crafts. It was like a thing that you did when you had sort of a little bit of wealth and luxury and time
Mm-hmm.
to do these things. And I think when you're a dentist who also already comes from some wealth, you can really sort of pick and choose, except for emergencies, your patients, and you have a lot more free time
Yeah.
to have a hobby like this that is maybe very time consuming.
Yeah.
I think when we're talking about Dr. Tishner from the previous decade, he was living in a lot more precarious times. The whole entire country was dealing with what's known as the Panic of 1837.
Mm-hmm.
And there was actually a real economic downturn
Yeah.
start the 1840s.
Yeah.
And I think that he was in a place that was a little bit more volatile in terms of its culture. Rochester was certainly it just was so expanding at such an incredibly huge rate. And I think when Dr. Coleman sort of arrived on the scene in the 1850s, Canandaigua was an earlier town. It was much more established. It was a little bit wealthier overall in terms of I think more people were a little bit more middle class as opposed to Rochester, which had certainly fantastically wealthy people like Sibley or Ely, whose house is still in Cornhill, or the Livingstons. And then you had very poor people, especially people that were connected to the canal. And so you had this
Sure.
very wide range of incomes, and there was definitely sort of a disparity because it was such a larger place. I think that things were a little bit more smoothed out in Canandaigua. That's my impression, just from my looking around the town and seeing how many buildings are from this time period, that sort of decade that straddles the mid-century. And you know, Rochester had like just so many people that worked in factories,
Yeah.
you know, they were probably pretty dirt poor. There were so many people that were doing things on the canal. It was definitely sort of like much more a working town. And and I think that when Tishner was being a dentist, of course, there were all these other dentists at the same time that were maybe more established. Um, and he had 4 kids, and he died of cholera
Mm.
at such a young age. The fact that we have all this stuff and know all this about him, and he was this young person who didn't even make it to 1850.
Mm.
Dr. Coleman lived a much longer life. He also died suddenly, pneumonia. Both of these doctors died very suddenly. Like they got sick and they died like within days.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that, Tishner didn't sort of have that head start of the family income
Sure.
behind him. That's what I see. And he was just sort of trying to make ends meet. And to me, it's amazing that he was able to build that house. Now, I don't know if he ever paid it off. Maybe his wife had to pay it off. You know, um, I still need to see if the place is extant. Now, so I guess for me, what's weird is that somebody who is like, I think what you sort of see with Dr. Tishner is not quite desperation, but more like, oh, how can I make a lot more money than what I'm
Mm.
doing for my family? And I'm going to try this new thing, which is telegraphy. And then seeing that it's not working, because we don't even really know what he did, really, he went back to, servicing the mouths of Rochester in the Reynolds Arcade. Whereas, Dr. Coleman, he has super established, his family's established. He went to college, he went to on the grand tour of Europe, he's back in town, he's, got his practice. He's somebody who's able to have this hobby,
Yeah.
So, they're both tinkering, but I think that, Tishner was like tinkering. It was almost like a multi-level marketing plan that you think is going to make money. It's like, oh, I got to get on Bitcoin, or, so it's like
Uh-huh.
that. I mean, it
Uh-huh.
was really that kind of thing where, it was so new and so weird, that you would actually be able to create a metal wire that you weren't using to hang a picture, you
Yeah.
know, across miles, and then you could send electricity, a spark through it to actually make communication. And I think that was the other thing is, here's Dr. Coleman doing something that's been around since 1839 in some form. It's been around for 20 years when he started making pictures,
Mm.
whereas Tishner was trying to do it within the next year.
Yeah.
He was literally trying to harness lightning, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
you know. But Coleman was able to just do what everyone else was doing, had been doing for 20 years, making these pictures, going through all these different formats.
Yeah.
And he was really on the cusp of paper photography, which I think is great, is that he was right on that edge of, the late 1850s into 1860. And by mid 1860s, nobody was taking ambrotypes in those little cases. No one was taking miniatures. No one was taking daguerreotypes.
Hmm.
That was totally given up as people started moving into paper photography.
Yeah.
And tintypes. People love those too. Uh, we didn't even talk about those, but that's a whole nother thing.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but to me, the fact that the camera that he had made, that was the super large format camera, and the fact that the surviving negatives that we have of either his family members or the neighborhood are these super large negatives, this shows to me that he was somebody who had enough money to pursue this hobby in a big way. These are
Yeah.
big pictures,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you went to a studio at this time, it would have been like a miniature. Like the
Right.
negative to make the CDV would have been the size of a credit card.
Hmm. Yeah.
So,
Right.
maybe you
Right.
would have gotten a slightly bigger 4x5, but not this. This was like a big deal. This is sort of approaching Southworth and Hawes full plate daguerreotype kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so for me to see this with him, I'm like, oh wow, this is like a, you know, and to see that negative in person was just like astonishing to see how big.
How
So I
big
was
the
like,
place
oh
was.
crap,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
Great. I do have a hi from you from the chat from a Lisa Kleeman,
Oh, great. Hi,
saying that
Lisa.
she was very glad she could catch your talk.
Oh, well, Lisa is a historian and author as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so she's
Great.
terrific. Yep, yeah, and she and I have worked quite a bit on the Jenny Lind situation in Rochester.
Okay. Uh huh. Very
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, so very cool, wonderful.
And then I'll unless anybody in the chat has a last question they want to ask, I'll wrap us up
Okay, terrific.
with a question here, which is just it's just occurred to me. You said Western Union was sending telegraphs until 2006.
Yes,
Why were they sending telegraphs in 2006?
I don't know, but when they did, there was an article about it in the New York Times, and it used the sort of phraseology, with the word stop, because that was the end of a phrase.
Sure.
Last telegram sent, stop. I don't know who it was sent from and who it was sent to, but I know it's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, we still see a little bit of the language of telegraphy in some legal stuff.
Sure.
Sometimes you'll see things like, oh, they were charged with wire fraud. Well, what does that mean?
Oh,
And the wire
sure.
that they're referring to is like telegraph wire, like
Okay.
people were like cheating people over telegraphy or cheating people through sending money,
Uh huh.
because that became a thing. You could actually, go to an office, give them $100, pay a little fee, and then at the other end they would say, "We got $100. Give that person $100." And it became like this weird banking system, and it became this super monopoly because of that. And of course now what we're seeing Zelly is now going through an actual bank. You're
Yeah.
not doing it through your phone. So that's a curious thing, because in many ways people are using things like the Cash App or Venmo
Yeah.
to send money through the internet in a way that is very similar to the way people still send money through Western Union, like to other countries, or that
Yeah.
they were before. You
Huh.
know, and so yeah, so I've always been curious, like, what was the very last message? Because of course we know what the exact first message was.
Right. Right.
We know
Right.
what hath God wrought.
Right.
It's 4 or 5 words, but
Yeah.
whatever the last message was, it's probably something really stupid and innocuous, like don't forget to buy milk, or I don't know,
Right.
or pick me up at 4. I don't.
Yeah.
It would be very curious to see what the very last message was.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, and
and
I know that even after telegraphy started becoming like less common for at least for a while, it was still used for certain military purposes. So,
it was because it was very ingrained into the military, especially
right.
the United States Army.
Right.
It was used like tons during the Civil War. In fact, at the end of the Civil War, I've seen reports that Hiram Sibley was like the fifth or sixth wealthiest person in America,
Yeah.
because the Army used telegraphy so much to
Right.
send messages.
Right.
And then, of course, we've all seen a zillion movies set in World War II
Mhm.
where the message boy knocks on the door, and of course it's always bad news.
Yep. Yep.
But it was at the time when people didn't have personal telephones,
Right.
and you needed to get a message to somebody almost instantaneously, as quickly as possible, and it was a direct message.
Yeah.
It was like, I need to give this message to this person. Here you go.
Right.
It was still the way that people did it,
Yeah.
and There's always, this a crying family in a movie because, their son got killed in World War II. But
Right.
that message was sent because the system was built into the military. It was instantaneous. And, you look at that cable that went across the ocean in the 18 freaking 50,
Right.
you know, there
Right.
were there were telegraphic messages to Europe for almost 100 years before World War II,
Yeah.
which is crazy. And
Yeah.
maybe not so much telephonic messages. The telephone, I think it needed a lot more bandwidth, a lot more juice
Sure.
to be able to hear the sound of a voice over that was being translated over the lines, as opposed to the pulse that would trigger the clicks on the receiving machine that were
Yeah.
then transcribed. It's astonishing that this was a thing before like phone, before movies,
Right.
before sound recording. All this was like 30 years before, you
Right.
know. And the fact that the person who really was able to develop and create the first telegraphic system, Morse, was also into photography at the start, at day one, and taught all these other people who have become so influential and taught other people.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
just, it's wild. It's wild. It's wild. So, yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Gerry. And thank you, everyone who tuned in this evening for the talk. I hope you liked it. And the next talk will take place on, I believe it's February 13th, but you can double check our website to make sure. But it will take place on February 13th. And Dave Wilson will be presenting, and he does still actively does a 19th century types of photography. So he'll be talking about that, and
Yeah.
we'll look forward to you all joining us for that talk if you can. And hope everybody has a great rest of your night.
Uh, Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.